Working for the Shadow King of Seoul comes with a life expectancy of less than a year. There are 3 boundaries you never cross in Han Du-kyun's estate if you want to see the sun rise. First, never speak unless he commands it. Second, never enter the basement laboratory. Third, never, ever let the Rottweiler see your fear. Noelle Ashcroft, a Black Maid, survived exactly 6 hours before she looked the devil's hound right in the eye. The morning air in the courtyard was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and raw iron. She stood frozen, the silver tray in her hands rattling against her porcelain-white maid's apron. 10 feet away, Han Du-kyun, the man who owned half of the city's docks and all of its secrets, strained against a heavy leather lead. His knuckles were white, the ink of his neck tattoos shifting as his muscles bunched. He wasn't just holding a dog, he was holding back a storm. Kage, a black-clad nightmare of a Rottweiler, lunged with a guttural roar that vibrated in her chest. The beast's jaws snapped inches from her throat, flecks of foam landing on her collar. "Don't move, girl," Du-kyun growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that mirrored the dog's. He reached for the heavy firearm holstered at his hip, his eyes calculating the cost of her life versus his prized weapon of war. He expected her to scream. He expected a mess for the cleaning crew. Instead, she did the one thing that made the most powerful man in Korea freeze. She stepped closer. She let the tray fall, the crash echoing through the silent courtyard, and reached out a hand that didn't tremble. She didn't see a monster. She saw the same broken spirit she'd spent her childhood healing in the slums of London. "Easy, little shadow," she whispered, the rhythmic clicking of her tongue cutting through the dog's rage. The silence that followed was deafening. The Rottweiler didn't bite. He bowed. "Welcome to Seoul Syndicate Stories. Thank you if you are just joining us. Before we continue, please subscribe to this channel, click the notification bell so you never miss any story, give thumbs up, and share with others. Tell me where you're watching from. Every one of your clicks, your comments, and every bit of love you show helps us to keep uncovering these unforgettable stories together. Find a quiet place to settle in, and let me take you somewhere you've probably never been before. Thanks for watching. The silence following the dog's submission was a physical weight, pressing against the stone walls of the courtyard. Han Du-kyun didn't move. His hand remained frozen on the grip of the weapon at his hip, his knuckles a sharp, bloodless white. He looked at Kage, the beast that had once shredded a reinforced bite suit in seconds. Now sitting as still as a statue, eyes fixed on the slender woman in the black and white uniform. Then, Du-kyun's gaze shifted to Noelle. He didn't look at her with the dismissive coldness he used for the rest of his staff. His eyes were narrowed, calculating, tracing the line of her trembling shoulders and the steady, outstretched hand she hadn't yet pulled back. He stepped forward, his polished Italian leather shoes crunching softly on the gravel. Every step was a deliberate display of ownership. "Where did you learn that?" His voice was a low, dangerous vibration. He didn't ask, he demanded. Noelle finally drew her breath, the air hitching in her chest. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, leaving her limbs heavy and cold. "My grandmother," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "She kept a sanctuary. She taught her that everything that bites is usually just trying to scream." Du-kyun stopped less than a foot from her. The height difference was suffocating. Noelle felt the heat radiating from his suit, the scent of expensive sandalwood and something sharper, the metallic tang of adrenaline. He was so close she could see the faint, jagged scar that cut through the tattoos on his neck, disappearing beneath his crisp white collar. He reached out. Noelle flinched, her eyes fluttering shut, expecting the back of his hand or a rough shove. Instead, she felt the ghost of his fingertips beneath her chin. With agonizing slowness, he forced her head up until she was staring directly into the dark, bottomless pits of his eyes. "Rule number 1, Noelle," he murmured, his thumb brushing the sensitive skin of her jaw. "I told you never to make eye contact. You've broken it twice in 60 seconds. The dog was going to kill me," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I thought rules didn't apply to the dead." A shadow of a smirk, gone before it could truly form, flickered at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of kindness. It was the look of a predator who had found a new, fascinating toy. He let go of her chin, but he didn't move away. The proximity was a brand. "Kage hasn't sat for anyone in 3 years, Du-kyun said, turning his attention back to the Rottweiler. The dog let out a soft whine, its tail giving a singular, hesitant thump against the ground. Du-kyun's expression darkened. Not even for me. He looked back at Noelle, his eyes scanning her simple bun, her modest apron, and the raw courage hidden in her gaze. The power imbalance in the courtyard was absolute. Yet for the first time in his life, Han Dukyun felt a thread of control slipping through his fingers. It wasn't the dog he was worried about anymore. From this moment, you are no longer a maid, he stated, his voice ringing with finality. Noelle blinked, confusion flickering across her face. Sir, you will move your things to the east wing. You sleep where the dog sleeps. You eat when he eats. If he snaps at anyone, it's your neck in the collar. If he suffers, you suffer. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear as he whispered the final condition. And Noelle, if you ever use that voice to turn him against me, I won't use a leash to stop you. He turned on his heel, the heavy lead trailing behind him like a whip, leaving Noelle standing alone in the center of the courtyard. She looked down at her hands. They were finally shaking. The east wing was a fortress of glass and cold marble, smelling of expensive floor wax and the underlying musk of a caged predator. Her small suitcase felt like a lead weight in her hand as she followed Han Dukyun's silent, broad-shouldered silhouette through the high-arched corridors. He didn't look back to see if she was keeping up. He didn't have to. In this house, his gravity pulled everything into his orbit. He stopped abruptly in front of a heavy oak door. This is your station, he said, turning to face her. The movement was so fluid it felt like a threat. Kage's quarters are through that connecting door. You will sleep with the lock engaged on your side, but if he wakes up screaming, you will go to him. Is that understood? Screaming? She whispered, her thumb tracing the hem of her apron. Dukyun stepped into her personal space, his shadow swallowing her whole. He smelled of dark cedar and the ozone of a coming storm. He has nightmares, Noelle. Just like I do. But when he has them, he bites. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his dark eyes searching her expression for a crack in the armor. Are you still so brave when the sun goes down? I'm here, she said, her voice steadier than her heart. I'm not running. We'll see. The next few days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Dukyun didn't just assign her as a handler. He became her shadow. Everywhere she went with Kage, the high-walled garden, the grooming bay, the reinforced training room. Dukyun was there. He would sit in a high-backed leather chair, a glass of amber liquid in one hand, watching her with a predatory focus that made the skin on the back of her neck prickle. He watched the way she brushed Kage's coat, her fingers working through the tangles with the rhythmic clicking sound that made the dog's ears perked with joy. He watched the way she leaned her forehead against the animal's massive skull, whispering secrets she would never dare tell a human. One evening, the tension finally snapped. She was kneeling on the floor, trying to coax Kage to take a piece of dried liver, when she felt the air in the room change. Dukyun had stood up. She didn't look, but she heard the rhythmic tap of his leather soles on the hardwood. He stopped directly behind her. You're too soft with him, he murmured. She could feel the heat of his body against her back, though he wasn't touching her. You treat him like a pet. He is a weapon. He was bred to tear throats, not to play in the grass. He was bred to be loyal, she countered, looking up at him from her knees. From this angle, he looked like a dark god, the light from the chandelier catching the sharp line of his jaw. You've been trying to command him with fear. You can't command a soul that's already been broken by it. Dukyun's hand shot out, his fingers catching a loose strand of hair that had escaped her bun. He didn't pull it. He simply wound it around his index finger, drawing her head back until she was forced to look at him. The power imbalance was staggering. The maid on the floor, the master looming above, but the heat in his gaze wasn't just anger. It was a dark, starving curiosity. And what about my soul, Noelle? He asked, his voice dropping to a silk-wrapped blade. Is it broken, or just waiting for the right voice to tame it? Her breath hitched, her lips parting as the air in the room seemed to vanish. Kage let out a low, protective huff, his head resting on her knee, his eyes darting between us. For a second, the world narrowed down to the touch of Dukyun's skin and the dangerous promise in his eyes. The heavy thud of a fist on the door shattered the moment. Boss, a voice called from the hallway, his brother Han Seo-jun. The elders are here. They're asking why a servant is spent all her time in the East Wing. Dukyun didn't let go of her hair immediately. He lingered for a heartbeat, his thumb grazing her temple. You're a distraction, he whispered, his eyes darkening with a sudden, icy resolve. And in my world, distractions are usually eliminated. He released her and turned toward the door, leaving her breathless on the floor. As the heavy oak slammed shut, she realized the dog wasn't the only thing in this house that was dangerous when it felt a connection. She looked down at Kage, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the same fear in his eyes that was currently clawing at her throat. The elders were coming, and they didn't just want the dog. They wanted to know why the Shadow King was finally starting to bleed. The steam in the grooming bay was thick, smelling of wet fur and the expensive, sandalwood-scented shampoo Dukyun insisted on using. Kage stood unusually still, his massive paws submerged in the sunken marble tub. She worked the lather into his coat, her fingers moving in the slow, circular motions that had become our private language of trust. For a moment, the heavy silence of the east wing felt almost peaceful, until her palm brushed against a lump near his hindquarters. She paused, her heart stuttering. She rinsed the soap away with a low, soothing hum, expecting a cyst or a matted patch of fur. Instead, as the black coat flattened under the water, a cluster of small, angry red punctures emerged. They were fresh, little bruised entry points, perfectly spaced, hidden deep beneath the thick guard hairs where no one would think to look. Her stomach dropped. These weren't from a fight. They were surgical, methodical. She shifted her weight, moving to check the other side, her hands trembling now. Kage let out a low, pained whimper and shifted his weight away from her. "Easy, boy," she whispered, though her own voice was tight with a sudden, scorching fury. She found more. Some were scarred over, white and raised. Others were still scabbing. Someone wasn't just taming this dog. They were chemically breaking him. "What did you find?" The voice hit her like a physical blow. She spun around, her knees sliding on the wet tile. Han Dukyun stood in the doorway. He looked at the dog, then at her face, his eyes narrowing as he registered the tears of rage shimmering in her eyes. "He's being poisoned," she said, the words coming out as a jagged edge. She didn't care about the rules or the eye contact anymore. She stood up, her wet apron clinging to her legs, and pointed at the dog's flank. "Look at him. Someone is injecting him, Dukyun. This isn't nature, and it isn't trauma. This is sabotage." The air in the room turned arctic. Dukyun crossed the floor in 3 predatory strides. He didn't look at the marks at first. He looked at her, his hand gripping her upper arm with a strength that was just short of painful. He pulled her aside and leaned over the tub, his jaw set so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He ran his gloved thumb over the punctures. Kage flinched, a guttural warning beginning in his throat, but the dog didn't lunge. He looked at her, pleading. "I didn't order this," Dukyun hissed, more to himself than to her. His eyes were no longer just cold. They were murderous. He turned back to her, his face inches from mine, his breath warm against her skin. "The only people with access to this wing are the kitchen staff, my inner circle, and my brother." "Then your house is a den of snakes," she snapped, the fear for Kage overriding her instinct for survival. "He's been acting erratic because he's in pain. He's being drugged to make him look like a liability. To make you look like you can't control your own territory." Dukyun's grip on her arm tightened, then suddenly shifted. His hand slid up to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the damp hairs that had escaped her bun. It was a gesture of terrifying intimacy. He pulled her closer, until she was forced to lean against the hard planes of his chest. "If you're lying to her, Noelle," he whispered, his voice a lethal caress against her lips, "I will make sure you never walk out of these gates. But if you're right," he paused, his gaze dropping to her mouth before snapping back to her eyes. "If you're right, I've been feeding the person who is trying to kill us both." He let her go so abruptly she stumbled against the marble tub. He didn't offer a hand. He just stared at the dog, then at the heavy oak door that led back to the main house. "Finish the bath," he commanded, his voice returning to that clinical, terrifying calm. "Don't tell a soul what you saw. From this second, you don't eat anything you don't prepare yourself, and you don't let anyone touch that dog's food. Not even my brother." He turned to leave, but stopped at the threshold, his silhouette framed by the hallway light. "And Noelle, sleep with your door unlocked tonight. If they're coming for the dog, they're coming for the girl who saved him." The moon hung low over the Han estate, casting long, jagged shadows across the private garden of the east wing. The air was biting, but she didn't feel the cold. She was sitting on the damp grass, Kage's massive head resting heavily in her lap. The dog was shivering, not from the temperature, but from the phantom pains of the toxins still working through his system. She hummed the low, rhythmic melody her grandmother used for the horses that had been beaten past the point of spirit, her fingers gently tracing the velvet softness of his ears, avoiding the raw puncture marks on his flank. "You're going to be okay," she whispered into the dark. "I'm watching now. No more needles. No more pain." A floorboard creaked behind her, the heavy, purposeful sound of a handmade shoe. She didn't startle. She knew the weight of that footstep. Han Dukyun didn't say a word as he stepped into the moonlight. He had discarded his tie, and the top 3 buttons of his shirt were undone, exposing the dark ink of a dragon's tail that curled up toward his collarbone. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes making him look less like a king and more like a man drowning in his own crown. He didn't stand over her this time. To her shock, he sat down on the stone bench a few feet away, his long legs stretched out, his gaze fixed on the swaying cypress trees. "My father told me that feelings were a luxury the poor enjoyed because they had nothing else to lose," he said, his voice sandpaper dry. "He said if you love something, you give your enemy a handle to pull you down with." She kept her hand on Kage's head, feeling the dog's heartbeat steadying. "Is that why you treat everyone like an enemy? Because you're afraid of being pulled down?" Dukyun's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous heat. "Careful, Noelle. You're forgetting who pays for your silence." "I haven't forgotten," she said, meeting his gaze. The power imbalance was still there. He was the master, she was the help. But in the moonlight, the edges of our roles were blurring. "But she also see a man who sits in the dark with a dog he can't tame and a brother he can't trust. That doesn't look like power to her. It looks like a cage." He rose from the bench, but he didn't walk away. He moved toward her, kneeling in the grass until our faces were level. The scent of dark tobacco and expensive bourbon rolled off him. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his fingers finally settled against her neck, right where her pulse was leaping like a panicked animal. His skin was scorching. "You think you know me because you can talk to a beast?" he murmured, his thumb dragging slowly across her lower lip. The touch was a violation of every rule in the house, yet she found myself leaning into it, her breath catching in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You're a maid, Noelle. You're supposed to be invisible. You're supposed to be safe." "I stopped being safe the moment I walked into the East Wing," she whispered. His gaze dropped to her mouth, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped. The hunger in his eyes wasn't just physical. It was a desperate, terrifying need for something real in a life built on lies. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, his grip on the back of her neck tightening just enough to command her total attention. "If I touch you," he breathed, his voice a jagged promise, "there is no going back. My brother is already watching. The elders are already whispering. If I make you mine, I make you a target." She didn't pull away. She reached up, her small, calloused hand resting against his jaw, feeling the stubble and the tension of a man who was one step away from breaking. "I've been a target since the day I was born, Dukyun. At least this time, I know what I'm fighting for." He let out a low, guttural sound, half groan, half growl, and crushed his lips against mine. It wasn't a soft kiss. It was a collision of desperate souls, tasting of salt and forbidden heat. But as he pulled her into the hard planes of his chest, a sharp, metallic click echoed from the balcony above. We broke apart instantly. Kage stood up, a low, murderous snarl ripping from his throat as he faced the house. High above, a silhouette moved back into the shadows, the moonlight glinting off the lens of a camera. Dukyun stood up, his face hardening back into the mask of the Shadow King. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by a cold, lethal clarity. "He has the photos," he said, his eyes fixed on the empty balcony. "The war didn't just start, Noelle. It just moved into your bedroom." The heavy oak door of the east wing didn't creak. It hissed as it swung open, admitting a presence that felt entirely different from Dukyun's weighted darkness. Han Seojun walked in with a smile that never reached his eyes, his designer suit a shade of gray that looked like smoke. He held a small, amber glass jar as if it were a holy relic. "I heard the little bird was having trouble with our beast," Seojun said, his voice light, melodic, and entirely false. He didn't wait for an invitation. He crossed the marble floor, his eyes darting to Kage, who was pacing restlessly by the floor-to-ceiling windows. She stood her ground, her hands hidden in the folds of her apron to mask the tremor in her fingers. "The dog is resting, Mr. Han. The boss gave strict orders that he isn't to be disturbed." Seojun stopped, his gaze raking over her with a slow, insulting deliberateness. He knew about the garden. He knew about the kiss. She could see the victory dancing in his pupils. The boss is distracted, Noel. He's blinded by novelties. But she cares about this animal's performance. These are specialized vitamins from a clinic in Switzerland. High potency. They'll stop that shaking of his. He held the jar out. She didn't take it. The air between us spiked with a sudden, sharp scent that bypassed her logic and went straight to the memories of her grandmother's apothecary. Under the synthetic mask of the vitamin coating, there was a faint, earthy bitterness. A cold, acrid note of damp earth and rot. Hemlock. In small doses, it caused the very tremors and respiratory distress Kage was exhibiting. In a concentrated vitamin dose, it would stop his heart mid-stride, making it look like a natural failure under stress. Take them, Seojun urged, his voice dropping an octave. Unless you want to be the reason the Shadow King loses his greatest weapon. Imagine the disappointment on my brother's face when he realizes his favorite maid let his dog die. She reached out, her skin crawling as her fingers brushed his. The jar felt ice-cold. She unscrewed the lid, pretending to inspect the capsules. The scent was unmistakable now, the devil's porridge. Her grandmother had used a single leaf to sedate dying livestock. This jar contained enough to kill a dozen men. I'll make sure he gets them with his evening meal, she said, her throat dry. See that you do. I'll be watching the security feed. She wanted to see him regain his strength. Seojun leaned in, his mouth inches from her ear. You're playing a high-stakes game, Noel. Don't forget that in this house, the help is always the first to be discarded when the mess gets too big to clean. He turned and strolled out, the click of his heels sounding like a countdown. She waited until the door latched before she collapsed against the grooming table. The amber jar clutched to her chest. Her heart was thundering. He wasn't just poisoning the dog anymore. He was handing her the murder weapon. If Kage died tonight, the camera would show her feeding him the capsules. Dukyun would have no choice but to execute her himself to maintain face with the elders. Kage walked over, nudging her hand with his cold nose, sensing her panic. She looked at the dog, then at the jar, then at the black dome of the security camera in the corner of the ceiling. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was an accomplice in a slow-motion execution. And the only man who could save her was currently the one person she couldn't go to without proving my brother's point. She looked at the hemlock, then at the door to Dukyun's private study. The vitamins weren't for the dog. They were a test for her. And if she didn't find a way to switch them before the evening feed, the Shadow King wouldn't be the only one losing his heart tonight. She stood up, my jaw set. She needed to get into Dukyun's office. Not for a kiss and not for a secret. She needed the ledger that proved where Seojun was buying his medicine. But to get it, she would have to break the one rule that even Dukyun wouldn't forgive. She looked at the camera and smiled, a cold, hard mimicry of the boss's own expression. Eat up, Kage, she whispered loudly for the microphones. It's time for your medicine. The shadows in the corridor didn't just hide her. They felt like they were reaching for her. Noel had exactly 12 minutes. The window when the security team rotated and Dukyun was occupied with the syndicate elders in the main hall. My pulse was a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a stark contrast to the deathly stillness of the house. She reached the heavy, double mahogany doors of the boss's private study. Her hand hovered over the handle. To enter without an invitation was a death sentence. To stay outside was to watch Kage die. She pushed. The room smelled of old paper, expensive scotch, and the faint, lingering scent of Dukyun's sandalwood cologne. It was a workspace designed to intimidate, filled with sharp angles and cold surfaces. She didn't head for the desk. She went for the safe concealed behind the hand-painted silk screen. She knew the code. She'd watched his reflection in the window glass 2 nights ago. A secret she'd tucked away without knowing she'd need it so soon. 3-1-0-8. The date of his mother's passing. The only moment of softness she'd ever found in his files. The mechanism clicked. A sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the vacuum of the room. Her fingers scrambled through stacks of black market ledgers and property deeds until she found it. The private ledger for estate maintenance and security. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning past ammunition costs and payroll for enforcers. There, a recurring payment to a shell company called Apex Bio. The dates matched perfectly with Kage's seizures. But the signature at the bottom of the procurement wasn't Dukyun's precise, angular script. It was a flamboyant, sloppy scrawl she recognized from the vitamin jar. Seo-jun. A floorboard groaned behind her. She didn't scream, but the air vanished from her lungs. She shoved the ledger back and spun around, her back hitting the cold metal of the safe. Han Du-kyun stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, and his tie was hanging loose around his neck. He looked less like a boss and more like a predator who had finally cornered the one thing he couldn't quite understand. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed. "I gave you the keys to my dog's life, Noelle," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that made her skin shiver. "I didn't think you'd use them to pick the lock on mine." "I wasn't stealing," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay still. "I was looking for the truth. The truth your brother is hiding in your own safe." He crossed the room in 3 long, silent strides. The power imbalance was a physical weight, pinning her against the wall as he leaned in, his hands slamming against the safe on either side of her head. He was so close she could see the golden flecks in his dark eyes, and the raw, jagged pain he tried so hard to mask. "My brother is blood," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "You are a maid I found in the dirt. Why should I believe a single word that comes out of your mouth?" "Because your brother is the one holding the needle," she snapped, the adrenaline finally turning into a desperate courage. "And I'm the only one who cares enough to stop him. Kill me if you want, Du-kyun, but check the ledger first. Check the payments to Apex Bio." His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The tension between was a live wire, humming with a dangerous mix of betrayal and a desire that felt like a sin. His hand moved from the safe, his fingers tangling in the front of her apron, pulling her forward until their chests collided. "If you're wrong," he murmured, his breath hot against her skin, "I'll personally walk you to the gates and hand you to the men who've been looking for you. And if I'm right." He didn't answer. Instead, his grip on her apron tightened, and for a second, she thought he was going to kiss her or kill her. But the sound of footsteps approaching the door broke the spell. "Boss!" Seo-jun's voice echoed from the hall. "The elders are asking for the ledger. Is everything all right?" Du-kyun's eyes never left. He reached behind her, slammed the safe shut, and pulled her into the shadows of the silk screen just as the door handle turned. We were pressed together, heartbeat to heartbeat, in a space too small for secrets. "Stay quiet," he breathed into her ear, his hand covering her mouth. "Or we both die tonight." The darkness behind the silk screen was suffocating, thick with the scent of gun oil and the terrified heat rising from her skin. Du-kyun's hand remained clamped over her mouth, his palm a callous barrier that tasted of salt and iron. Through the thin gaps in the hand-painted fabric, I watched the silhouette of Han Seo-jun enter the room. He moved with a sickeningly casual confidence, his shadow stretching across the floor like an oil slick. "Brother," Seo-jun called out, his voice echoing against the cold mahogany walls. "I know you're in here. The help said you left the elders early. Is our little guest from the East Wing keeping you busy?" Du-kyun's chest was a wall of tension against her back. She could feel his heart, slow, steady, and utterly lethal, thumping against her shoulder blades. His fingers tightened slightly on her jaw, a silent command to remain as still as a ghost. Seo-jun drifted toward the desk, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the surface where the ledger had been only moments ago. He lingered by the safe, his head cocking to the side as if sniffing the air for the scent of betrayal. "Careful, Seo-jun." Du-kyun's voice finally broke the silence, coming from directly beside her ear but projected outward with a chilling, ventriloquist precision. "The elders are already questioning your management of the security payroll. If you're looking for the ledger, I've moved it. Somewhere you'll never find it." Seo-jun froze. A tight, ugly smile twitched on his lips. "I was only looking for you, brother. To discuss the dog. He's fading. Perhaps it's time to stop letting the maid play veterinarian and handle things the old way." "Get out," Du-kyun commanded. The 2 words were delivered with the weight of a falling guillotine. Seo-jun lingered for a heartbeat, his eyes narrowed at the silk screen, before he turned on his heel and vanished into the hall. The click of the door latch felt like a stay of execution. Du-kyun didn't let go immediately. He waited until the footsteps faded into nothingness before he spun her around in the narrow space. The vulnerability from the garden was gone, replaced by a gaze so sharp it felt like it was peeling back her skin. He grabbed her wrists, pinning them against the wall above her head. The power imbalance was total. She was a girl in a stained apron, trapped by a man who could erase her from existence with a single phone call. He was looking for the ledger because he knows what's in it, she whispered, her breath hitching as he leaned into her, his heavy frame crushing the air from her lungs. He's been paying Apex Bio to kill your legacy, Duqian. If you don't believe me now, you're choosing to be blind. I am never blind, Noel, he rasped, his face so close his nose brushed mine. But I need more than a maid's word to execute my own blood. I need proof that the elders can't dispute. He let go of her wrists, his hand sliding down to grip the back of her neck, forcing her to look up into the storm of his eyes. You say you're loyal. You say you want to save the dog. Tonight, we'll see if you're willing to bleed for it. He reached into the safe and pulled out a small, high-frequency recording device. He pressed it into her palm, his fingers lingering over mine in a grip that was as much a promise as it was a threat. Go to the warehouse tonight. Seo-jun is meeting his contact from the lab at 2 a.m. Get the recording of the transaction. If you come back with it, you're the woman who saved the Han Empire. He paused, his thumb grazing her lower lip with a sudden, bruising intensity. If you don't come back, I'll tell the elders you were the one poisoning Kage. I'll make sure the world remembers you as the traitor. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over mine, a kiss that tasted of death and absolute surrender. One chance, Noel. Don't make me the man who has to kill you. He pushed her toward the secret servant's passage, his face hardening back into a mask of stone. She looked at the recorder in her hand, then at the man she was beginning to love, and realized she wasn't just fighting for a dog anymore. She was walking into a trap where the only way out was to betray the brother of the only man she'd ever truly feared. The warehouse smelled of stagnant river water and diesel, a cold tomb on the edge of the city. Noelle crouched behind a rusted shipping container. The recorder clutched so tightly in her palm that the plastic casing bit into her skin. Below, in the center of the concrete floor, Han Seo-jun stood beneath a single, flickering bulb. He wasn't alone. 2 men in white lab coats were handing him a fresh cooler, their voices muffled by the hum of a nearby generator. The final dose, Seo-jun's voice drifted up, oily and triumphant. Once the beast drops at the gala tomorrow, my brother's reputation goes with it. The elders won't follow a man who can't keep his own porch clean. She shifted, trying to get a better angle for the lens, when a heavy boot connected with her ribs. The world tilted. She was dragged from the shadows by her hair. A scream trapped in her throat as she was thrown onto the cold concrete at Seo-jun's feet. Her apron was torn, her knees scraped raw. Behind her stood 3 of the syndicate's enforcers, their faces masks of indifference. The little bird flew too far from the cage, Seo-jun sneered, kicking the recorder away before she could hide it. He looked up at the security camera mounted on the pillar. Are you watching, brother? Look at your loyal little pet, caught stealing from your own warehouse. Or should I tell the elders she was here to meet the suppliers who've been poisoning your dog? He pulled a silver pistol from his waistband, the click of the safety echoing like a death knell. He didn't point it at her. He pointed it at a large, iron-barred crate in the corner she hadn't noticed. Inside, Kage lay slumped on his side, his breathing shallow, his eyes rolled back. She's been the one killing him, Duqian, Seo-jun shouted at the camera, his face twisting into a mask of manic glee. And now, I'm going to do what you're too weak to do. I'm going to clean up the mess. He aimed at the dog's head. She scrambled forward, grabbing Seo-jun's ankle, her nails drawing blood through his expensive socks. No, it was you. I have the records. Die with the dog, Noelle, he hissed, swinging the butt of the gun toward her temple. But the blow never landed. A sound erupted from the crate. Not a bark, but a primal, bone-chilling roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the warehouse. The heavy iron door, weakened by a bolt she had loosened hours before as a desperate precaution, flew off its hinges with a scream of tortured metal. Kage wasn't dying. The vitamins she had switched for pure adrenaline and her grandmother's herbal stimulants had finally hit his bloodstream. The dog was a blur of black fur and white teeth. He bypassed her entirely, his 130-pound frame colliding with Seo-jun before the man could pull the trigger. The gun skittered across the floor as Seo-jun shrieked, pinned to the ground by the beast he had tried to break. Kage's jaws snapped inches from his throat, a guttural, murderous vibration that signaled one thing. Give me a reason. Kage, stay! She screamed, her voice cracking. The dog froze. He didn't move, but the sheer power radiating from him held the enforcers at bay. They wouldn't move against a monster that looked like it had been sent from hell. The heavy warehouse doors groaned open. Han Duqian stepped out of the darkness, his long black coat billowing behind him like a shroud. He didn't look at his brother whimpering on the floor. He didn't look at the enforcers who were now dropping their weapons. He walked straight to her. He reached down, his large, scarred hand trembling slightly as he tucked a matted lock of hair behind her ear. He pulled her up from the cold floor, his grip possessive and fierce, drawing her into the hard heat of his chest. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice thick with a raw, terrifying emotion. "You actually stayed. I told you," she breathed against his heart. "I'm not running." Doo-kyun looked down at his brother, his eyes turning into shards of black glass. He whistled once. Kage backed off Seo-jun, but remained standing over him, a silent executioner. "Take him," Doo-kyun commanded the shadows. "And bring the ledger. I want the elders to see exactly what color my brother's blood is." He turned her away before the enforcers moved in, shielding her eyes with his hand. But as he led her toward the waiting car, he stopped. He leaned down, his lips brushing her forehead in a gesture that felt like a coronation. "The East Wing is yours, Noelle. And so is the man who lives there." He opened the door for her, but as she sat down, she saw a single black SUV idling at the edge of the lot, one that didn't belong to the Han family. A window rolled down just an inch, revealing a pair of eyes she didn't recognize. The war wasn't over. It had just gone global. The blood on the marble floor of the East Wing had been scrubbed away, but the scent of ozone and iron still lingered in the air. The purge had been silent, swift, and total. By dawn, the elders who had whispered against the Shadow King were gone, and Han Seo-jun had been erased from the family tree as if he had never existed. She stood in the center of the Grand Library, still wearing her torn maid's uniform, though a heavy cashmere coat, Doo-kyun's coat, was draped over her shoulders. Kage lay at her feet, his breathing deep and rhythmic, his head resting on her shoes as if he were anchored to the only person who had ever truly seen him. The heavy double doors opened, and Doo-kyun stepped inside. He had changed into a clean black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal hands that were scrubbed clean of the night's violence. He looked at the dog, then at her, and for the first time, the Shadow King looked fragile. The mask of absolute control was cracked, revealing a man who had spent his entire life building walls only to realize he had built himself a tomb. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her, his presence as overwhelming as ever. But the air between us had changed. The power imbalance hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. She was no longer a servant, and he was no longer just a master. "The car is waiting at the gates," he said, his voice a low, rough texture that vibrated in her chest. "Your debts are paid. There is a flight to London in 3 hours. You can walk out of here and never look back. You can forget you ever heard the name Han." She looked down at the recorder in her pocket, then up at his dark, guarded eyes. "Is that what you want? For me to forget?" Doo-kyun's jaw tightened. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt like an apology. "I want you safe. In my world, love is a death sentence. I've spent 30 years making sure no one could touch me. And then you walked into my courtyard and tamed the one thing I thought was as broken as I am." He stepped closer, his forehead resting against mine. The heat of him was a brand. "If you leave, I stay the king. If you stay..." He paused, his breath hitching. "If you stay, I become a man. A man who will spend every second of his life making sure no one ever hurts you again. But I won't have you as a maid, Noelle. I won't have you in an apron, hiding in the shadows of my house." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy key, not to a room, but to the Han family vaults. He pressed it into her palm, his large hand closing over mine. "Stay as my equal," he whispered, the words a desperate surrender. "Stay as the woman who holds the leash of the Shadow King. Help me build something that isn't made of blood and secrets." She looked at the key, then at the man who had been her terror and was now her world. She didn't need a flight to London. She had already found the only home she'd ever known. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down to her. The kiss was no longer a collision. It was a pact. "I'm staying," she breathed against his lips. He pulled her into the hard planes of his chest, his grip so fierce it was almost painful, as if he were trying to pull her soul into his own. For a moment, the world was silent. The dog was quiet. The house was still. But then, the chime of his phone shattered the peace. Doo-kyun pulled away just enough to look at the screen. His face went white. He turned the phone toward her, showing a grainy photo taken through a long-distance lens just seconds ago. It was a picture of them, framed in the library window, with a red cross drawn over her heart. They aren't coming for the Empire anymore, Noel, Dukyun said, his voice turning into a lethal, icy promise. They're coming for you. He walked to the wall, pressed a hidden panel, and revealed an arsenal that made the previous night's purge look like a rehearsal. He handed her a sleek, matte black handgun. The maid is dead, he said, his eyes burning with a dark, protective fire. It's time to show them why you're the queen. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If you enjoyed this story, please do well to subscribe, like, and share with others. Your support means so much more. Until we meet next time, believe in love, follow your heart, fight for what matters to you, and never give up on yourself. See you with the next story.